Welcome back to Just Liberty, where liberty and justice, well, we're trying to blend them together, trying to get them to meet, right, Bettina?
Exactly.
Uh, I'm Alan Reinach. I'm one of your hosts, president of the Church State Council, with my co host, Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, the oldest and best magazine devoted to religious freedom. And we are here hoping to get you to be informed and get involved. Now, one of the flashpoints in the United States and religious freedom for a number of years has been something called the Johnson Amendment. And we'll get into it in our interview, but broadly it deals with how political individual congregations, churches, religious bodies can be. So it's back in the news again with a lawsuit and changes within this administration. So, Bettina, why don't you take us right there? Because when it comes to hot button issues, churches being political is one of the hottest.
We are so happy to have with us today Pastor Chris Butler, who is lead pastor of Chicago Ambassador Church and director of Christian Civic Formation for the Center for Christianity and Public Life. He is also co-author of an excellent book that I often recommend to people, Compassion and Conviction, which is a guide to faithful civic engagement. Thanks so much for joining us, Chris.
Thank you so much, Bettina, for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
So I was really pleased to see your byline in Christianity Today recently, and you were addressing a topic that has been in the news of late, which is the enforcement of the so-called Johnson Amendment, which has a direct impact on how far churches and houses of worship can get involved in political campaigns. Maybe we should kind of start with the basics. What's the Johnson Amendment?
So I'm nobody's attorney, and so I'm not going to try to get into this like in a legal way. But essentially, the Johnson Amendment is an amendment that was offered by then Senator Johnson, who ultimately became President Johnson. But it basically instructs the IRS to enforce a rule that that 501c3 organizations, tax exempt organizations, because it's not just C3, tax exempt organizations cannot get involved in elections and politics. Otherwise, they put their tax exempt status in jeopardy. And so that's something that governs all sort of tax exempt organizations, but it certainly applies to the church as well.
Which is something I guess that you've had personal experience with, because you have a long background in politics and as a political staffer. So when you were working in that capacity, in what ways did you run up against the Johnson Amendment?
Yeah, so one of the things that I did a lot when I was working in politics in a lot of different roles, as doing advocacy work on issues for organizations, working in campaigns where politicians are running for office. And one of the things that I did in those roles was, faith outreach and faith engagement. Different folks call it different things, but it's essentially working to help get churches and faith leaders involved in civics and politics. And one of the concerns that leaders have, or at least had, I guess now, back in the time when I was doing this, was that Johnson Amendment. So if you want me to circulate a petition in my church or allow a candidate to come and visit, is that going to jeopardize our tax exempt status and put us in some sort of adverse relationship with the IRS, which, nobody wants an adverse relationship with
No.
the
And so you were kind of negotiating that boundary between what was appropriate to say in a church setting and what was not, what was going to cross those boundaries. So I guess what has changed in the last past couple of months is this proposed settlement that was filed by the IRS in a lawsuit that had challenged the constitutionality of the Johnson Amendment. And basically, it seems to me and to a lot of people that this IRS proposed settlement is sort of giving a wink and a nod to churches across the country and to other houses of worship, and basically saying the Johnson Amendment exists, it's still going to exist, but we're not going to enforce that. Is that your read?
I think that's essentially it, because I mean the question that's sort of at issue in the lawsuit is whether or not the Johnson Amendment itself is unconstitutional, whether it is sort of limiting not only free speech practice but also sort of freedom of religion, and so that's at issue, and the IRS is essentially saying like, okay, maybe it is not constitutional, at least when it comes uh, to people of faith and houses of worship. And so they use some interesting language in the filing. You know, that they're talking about, you know, that this sort of political activity is acceptable in terms of the sort of regular means of communication. And I'm not quoting it because I don't have it directly in front of me, but it's specifically talking about the regular means of communication. So the ways that you usually communicate, you can use those means to speak about political issues, and you know it's something worth discussing and considering, because they're essentially saying, you know, a conversation inside of a faith community is kind of a family conversation, right? That's a in the house conversation, and the government shouldn't be regulating what can be discussed in those inside the family conversations. I think it still leaves something to be considered and wrestled over in terms of outside of the family. So if a church wants to, like, you know, send out a mailer to just everybody in the community, that may not fall under the scope of what this filing is saying, but certainly the kind of things that folks who do the jobs that I've held are usually trying to get houses of worship to do are covered under this statement. Because if you're talking about circulating a petition inside of the church, having an elected official talk inside of the church, or even suggesting to church members who they should vote for and how they should exercise their sort of political activity, those things seem to me to be allowable under this proposed settlement, which, you know, has not yet even been accepted by the court.
No.
But it is, you know, it's been proposed, and so it's something to for us to start to consider for sure.
And, you know, it's interesting because even if the court doesn't accept this settlement, the proposal, I mean, I guess it's still the IRS has gone on the record saying we have no interest in enforcing this,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You know, as you were talking, it struck me that churches that have sort of chafed under this rule, they've made the argument that their free speech rights, their religious freedom rights have been kind of infringed by this restriction. And yet, in your experience, has the existence of the Johnson Amendment muzzled the church's ability to engage in important sort of prophetic preaching around public policy issues or social justice issues? I mean, how far has it really put a dampener on the church's ability to engage?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I wouldn't sit here and suggest that I'm, you know, qualified to speak about, you know, political engagement across every corner and sector of the church. I can say two things that I have observed with the Johnson Amendment, um, which is why, again, I just say it's an interesting conversation, and it is one worth having. Because one thing that does happen is that folks do not go as far as sometimes they would want to, because they have this concern about the Johnson Amendment. Are they going to cross some kind of a line of their sort of tax exempt status? And so that I have seen that, like, genuinely hinder a house of worship, a faith leader who might want to do a thing but feels a little tentative, especially, you know, folks who are coming at this, you know, for the first time. They're not, you know, the sort of political preacher, this can be a hindrance there. Absolutely, there are folks who don't experience those tensions, let's say,
Okay.
and just do their thing. But I have seen it hinder some folks. The other thing that I think is important to say is that I've seen the Johnson Amendment sort of be used by leaders who don't want to be pushed to act in ways that they maybe should, and they can hold up the Johnson Amendment and say, hey, I can't do it for legal reasons, even though it's really something that they just don't want to do. The Johnson Amendment can provide cover in that way, and so it is. I've been in a few conversations about this, and I would suggest to anybody who thinks that the Johnson Amendment has just been sitting out there and not having any impact on how the church and houses of worship engage in civics and politics. I think that would be a misread. I think that this does have impact in multiple ways, and so a change in that regulation could for sure, have impact, similarly across the board.
And I guess one answer to that would be to churches that have felt, muzzled in some way, would be you have perfect freedom of speech, freedom of religion to express and endorse candidates and what have you. You just have to give up your tax exempt status, which is a tax privilege rather than a right. Is that one way of thinking of it?
I mean, I've certainly heard people. I've certainly heard people argue that. I don't. I've heard people argue against that as well. That it shouldn't be, even though it is a tax privilege. We usually don't want to get into spaces where there are tax privileges that maybe one set of individuals or institutions can enjoy, but then a house of worship can't enjoy that privilege unless they're giving up sort of religious freedom. To me, that gets a little strange. Again, I thought about going to law school, ended up going to Bible school. So I'm not anybody's attorney on this, but it certainly registers with me when it's been suggested that the church should give up some freedom of religion in order to enjoy anything in our society that
Right.
folks who maybe don't have any religious faith might enjoy,
Right.
and not have to give up, any kind of religious freedom.
So my question then, since you went to Bible school, not to law school, what about from a biblical perspective? I mean, because this whole area of politics is just toxic today.
Yeah.
And, I don't know about you, but in my faith tradition, I hear stories from folk who just want to go to church as as a reprieve from that. They want to connect to values and ideas that go beyond what they're being bombarded with in the public space. So how do you as a pastor navigate that really difficult area of politics and ministering to all of the people in your congregation?
Yeah. And I think for those of us who lead churches and who attend churches, that's really the big question, right? Because I could talk a long time about the Johnson Amendment, and folks with legal background can talk even longer than I can about the Johnson Amendment. But at the end of the day, my question, even before this most recent filing from the IRS, and even kind of how I have positioned it before that filing, is that the church should first be applying a theological test and not a legal test, right? The church should be asking ourselves, what should we be doing in terms of sort of being in the world in the way of Jesus, and then everything else comes second to that, right? So even if it costs me my tax exempt status, if there is a thing that I need to do because of love, because of justice, because of compassion, because of righteousness, because of the things that should be primary on the church's sort of agenda, I need to do those things no matter what the IRS says, no matter what the sort of law entails. And so as this new IRS filing comes on, I think the same principle applies. Like, we should be applying that theological test, and that sort of like practical um, theology and practical religion test. Like, what would Jesus do? As when I was growing up, that little thing. That should be the big test. And so even if we are free, right, to stand in the pulpit and say, hey, you should vote for candidate X, the question is that what we should do? Right. So the same way that I maybe have pushed people in the past who were a little skittish about getting involved in civics because the Johnson Amendment was in place, and I would say to folks, but ought you to do something on this issue because it is the right thing to do? That should be the first question. Now, on the flip side, on the other side of this filing, I have the same sort of counsel for churches and church leaders. Okay, it seems like you could, if you wanted to, get in the pulpit and just say, go vote for candidate X. But is that the thing that you should do? Does that serve like the cause of the church? Shouldn't we, I would suggest, be more focused on discipling people through the word of Jesus and the way of Jesus, so that they can make these kinds of decisions on their own, rather than us, sort of just telling them like, "Hey, go and do this." Should we be putting the sort of stamp of the church on a particular candidate, no matter how much we like them? I would argue that there is a principle and a value that is much higher than anything that any candidate can actually attain to. And so we can't say that any candidate is going to like be the perfect embodiment of the kingdom of God and the realities of that kingdom. And so when we say to the church, this candidate is our candidate, are we confusing the church? Will we then regret it? Will we go back and, this candidate does something terrible, and now we put our name on? There are a lot of things there that would suggest to me that's not the way to go. But there are ways that we should be involved in civics and should be involved in politics, more in the way of discussing issues that are at play in our political life, about which the church should have something to say, and we should be free to say those things. But there are also things that we should not do, and the legal question for me is secondary to these questions about what should the church be doing, how should we be showing up in the world, how should we be discipling the people who have been entrusted to us by God to shepherd and disciple.
I mean, that right there is, to me, just powerful, because if a church does hitch their reputation to a particular candidate, I mean, the potential downsides of that are immense. And not only that, I guess there's a temptation once you've done that endorsement to sort of keep trying to self-justify,
Right.
even if that candidate starts getting further and further and further away from your own, core values, right?
Mm-hmm. I think it does. I mean, I think the sort of negative incentives there are they're just tremendous. I mean, I think, I have been involved, in political campaigns, and when we are trying to get actual endorsements from institutions that do that on a regular basis, unions and PACs and that type
Yeah.
of thing, and I just having been involved in those conversations, I don't think those are the conversations that the church should be having, right? Because it is, and I'm not coming against those conversations, because those institutions are not the church,
No.
and they have a much more. It is much more appropriate for those types of institutions to engage in this kind of transactional conversation with a political candidate. Uh, you know, what can you do for us? What can we do for you? If we can come to an agreement, then we do this endorsement. The church has to be focused on something that is much more transcendent than transactional. And so we should hold up principles in front of our politicians and our political culture, and say that these are things that we believe. We should hold them up in front of our parishioners and say these are the things to which we adhere, and the things in that we should be in pursuit of. And we don't come down from that, right? We don't. There's no give and take, right?
Right.
It's these standards are high and they don't come down. And it's not that any of us, not the parishioners, not the preachers, not the politicians, none of us do this thing perfectly. Um, but we don't bring down that standard. We can't bring down that standard. It is that high call that Paul talks about that we should be in pursuit of. And so I think we're called to be in the world in a different way. And because of the high nature of the values that we embrace, we have to understand that reasonable people and faithful Christians can come down in different places on the sort of temporal political questions of our day, and we have to allow for that. Because the other thing that you do when you endorse a political candidate is you say to anybody who's in your congregation who doesn't support that candidate, maybe the church or this congregation is not for you, right? And those are not the boundaries that we should be drawing around our congregations, right? Not these temporal political boundaries.
So I think in your article for Christianity Today, a phrase that particularly caught my attention was, I think you described it as a delicate dance. And I guess it could be a very tricky thing as a pastor, as in a practical way, to kind of discern what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, because you're wanting to speak to broader questions of values and biblical values, but not to specific endorsements and so on. So how do you as a pastor do that in a practical way?
Yeah, and that is the part that in some of my recent conversations people have regarded in the church to be somewhere between silly and corrupt, right?
Ah,
It, to actually sit down and say, all right, we can't say, we won't say, go vote for candidate X, but we will say, you know, this is wrong. We will say, it is wrong to take food out of the mouths of poor children. It is right to stand up for, the sanctity and importance of marriage and family. We will say that we're 10 toes down on the sort of, divine responsibility of parents to sort of be the primary governing authority in their children's lives, and not a government figure. We will say the things that we believe,
right.
right? And if there is a candidate who clearly believes way more of those things than another candidate, our people are intelligent. They will figure that out. Some people will look at it and say, well, you're being too cute by half, because folks know what you are doing. And that again is the place where I'm like, we have to be engaging our values, more than what are the legal questions, more than what are folks going to say about us, because that back and forth, that delicate dance, that idea that sometimes in the things that I say is going to be very clear that one person is is just way more on board with most of the stuff that we're doing. Oftentimes, though, I will also say in our politics, that's not the case. Um, Folks are picking up different parts of this big and transcendent thing that we believe, and folks are picking up and jiving with different parts of it at different times for different reasons. And so it's usually not that clear cut. Sometimes it is, but my thing is like, if it is, it just is. I've got nothing to do with that because I'm not really changing what I'm saying. I'm talking about scripture. I'm talking about the church, tradition. This is what we believe, and how that falls in a political in various political contexts is going to be different, and that's that delicate dance of saying, we will talk about these issues, we will talk about them with clarity, and what do I do when my clarity around issues seems to be at an actual endorsement?
Yeah.
Do I back off of that clarity sometimes? I would argue no, but that's the delicate dance, is figuring out what in my context needs to be said, because that's the other thing. I don't want to take all the time, is that sometimes those of us who stand in pulpits and local communities, week after week, take into our pulpits what we have gleaned from national media conversations, which I think is really, really dangerous, right? Because not everything that has been talked about in the sort of national media conversation is the most relevant thing for what needs to be said in a local pulpit in a local community. And so that's the other part of the dance, is what are the issues that are really impacting the lives of the people who sit in front of me every day. And I'll be quiet after this, but it's one of the great privileges, I think, of my life, especially with some of the things I get to do that are more national in scope. Is a great privilege to like be in a congregation of a little more than 200 people in a local community, in a local place. And I would urge folks who lead in those contexts not to undervalue that privilege of actually knowing real people in a real place in real ways. Because not everything that's been talked about in the national conversation is exactly what those people in your particular context are actually bumping up against week in and week out. And folks in the national conversation who don't have your local context and your local knowledge, they just don't know what needs to be said. And God has entrusted you sort of with that responsibility and privilege to discern what's the right thing to be talked about here. And just because they're arguing about it on, between MSNBC and Fox, doesn't mean that it needs to be addressed in the pulpit.
I mean, just listening to you talk, I mean, it sounds to me like, a pastor whose primary loyalty is to biblical truths and principles rather than political principles. When they're addressing these issues, if they're doing so in a faithful way, it's never, ever, ever going to line up perfectly left or right.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I think I don't think it's ever going to line up left and right.
Right.
I think there may be times in local context,
Yep.
and even sometimes in national context, where because of the candidates that are on offer, it can be very clear. Like, one is much more on board with the things that we believe than another. But I don't think it's ever going to line up perfectly with the sort of like broad left-right dichotomy that we have in our politics today.
And so when we as individual believers start getting very attached to one political party over another, what are the dangers that come with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I will haste to say that I think political parties are great vehicles to achieve political outcomes.
Okay.
And so I'm not opposed to like joining a party and being a part of a party. What I do oppose is putting your identity in that party instead of your identity being in Christ. Right? We should come to a political party understanding that, all right, I'm with this political party because of the things that are priority to me, which I don't have time to unpack, a lot, but that is okay, right? Like to be a Christian in a culture, it's like these are the things that matter to me. I'm not suggesting that these are the only things that matter, but these are the things that matter the most to me. And this political party is more aligned with me on these things that matter the most to me. That's all fine and good, but we should come to the political party understanding that, all right, we're going to be able to work together, achieve some things together that are important to us in common. But I am going to have to hold this political party accountable and be a prophetic voice inside of this political party in the spaces where the political party departs from the values of my faith. I'm not going to surrender my values to the party so that we can accomplish some political outcome.
This has just been such a thought-provoking conversation. Well, as we finish, I wonder what you would say to a pastor somewhere out, maybe in the middle of America, who's been
Mhm.
reading the news coverage of what's been happening with the Johnson Amendment and is kind of struggling in their mind as to how this, if at all, should affect their behavior. What would you say to that pastor?
I would say this shouldn't have that much impact on your behavior. What it does is offers us a moment to evaluate our civic behavior. Right? Are we behaving in public life in ways that honor the Lord? Because the sort of I talk about like the broad creedal traditions of the Christian church have much to offer our public life, and we do a disservice to our society, and I think we dishonor our Lord when we don't offer those gifts to our society, um, and so this should not be determinative of how you engage. It does offer us a moment, though, to evaluate um, our engagement, and we should take that moment.
Thank you so much, Pastor Chris Butler. Really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Bettina, listening to Chris, I'm reminded of an event that I attended sponsored by one of our Seventh-day Adventist organizations back in Atlanta. And one of the breakout sessions was hosted by an old-time African American pastor, civil rights leader, who was back in Martin Luther King Jr.'s day. I want to say he even pastored MLK's church. And I asked him the question, how does the political activity of the religious right differ from, the civil rights movement, from what the African American churches were doing? And I won't ever forget his answer. He said, and I quote, "They stole our playbook."
Huh. So
And
what exactly was he meaning by that?
well, he certainly didn't explain, but to the extent that the religious right has been very effective at organizing congregations, around specific moral and political issues and for political gain,
Right.
you know, but what strikes me is the politics of the black church are far less divisive within the black community than the politics of the white church. You know, you and I speak at many, many churches. You more, around nationally, mine more regionally here in the western part of the United States. But as I meet with pastors, I find that one of their struggles is that their churches are politically divided.
Right, exactly.
And so to speak to social and political issues as much as they may want to is fraught with challenges, because no matter what you say, one segment of the church is going to be upset.
Yeah, there's no question about that. But I wonder also, even within the Black Christian community, that recent years have brought more less cohesiveness politically as well. I mean, there's been a whole host of new social cultural issues that have been introduced into the mix, gender ideology, all manner of issues which are even within the Black tradition, Christian tradition, have introduced elements of difference, of divergence on issues of public policy. So I think the advice that I think is contained in Scripture to not hitch the gospel to any particular regime or political interest, I think that advice rings true now more than ever before.
So, first, your comment suggests the need for us to engage with some Black leaders about what's
Yes,
happening within the Black churches. I
right.
think that will be a fascinating avenue for exploration.
Yes, absolutely.
But you're also taking me back. Um, I want to say, the early 70s. Well, even before my interest in religious liberty awakened, which would have been, a few years later, I'm dating myself now. Chuck Colson of
Yes.
Watergate fame, one of the first books that he published after Born Again was a book called Kingdoms in Conflict. And one of the themes that he discussed there, because, part of his role in the Nixon administration was co-opting the churches.
Uh-huh.
And he basically said, the churches are easy to manipulate. Pastors are easy to manipulate. They're just so thrilled to, be able to shake the hands of, somebody in power and, to get those smiles and those photo ops and what have you. And they're very easily manipulated. And I wish that all of our churches and pastors had, read that. And Chuck obviously is hardly, he's not a liberal, he's not secular. He has been during his years very much a fixture of
Yeah.
the evangelical community, a leader. But I don't think we've heeded his counsel about the dangers of getting co-opted by politicians.
Well, if you think about it, Alan, since that time, politicians have made an art form in leveraging support from faith communities. Every politician has their faith engagement office or person, and they make a science of engaging these communities. And so if churches think that they can play with fire by engaging extensively with candidates during political seasons, I think the churches will always find themselves on the back foot, because the politicians are going to be more intentional and more cynical about using those churches to their own political advantage. I think we need to be triply wary of engaging in partisan politics, especially in our particular political era that we find ourselves, when it is so toxic.
Well, and so, there's a double-edged sword here, right? So there's the danger of the churches being manipulated,
Yeah.
but there's also the danger of the churches obtaining too much power and influence, which takes us back to the dark days of the Dark Ages, when, the church stepped into the vacuum at the collapse of the Roman Empire and exercised, considerable power. And, when religion is in power, it is never good for religious freedom.
No, no, especially for religious minorities. Religious minorities are the ones who lose out every time.
Well, and the freedom of the majority to maybe, differ or dissent somewhat from,
Yep.
the mainstream as well.
Yeah.
So if you're, nominally Muslim in Iran these days, you I guess enjoy some religious freedom unless you decide that you want to dissent from uh, the majority status quo.
Yeah.
God forbid you want to convert to Christianity, you might get killed.
So, which is our point exactly on this podcast, that church state separation, the Establishment Clause, is something that works both ways. It's not just religion being exempt from government interference, it's protecting the government from religious interference. And that is the basis for religious freedom. Full stop.
And, in our founding, Jefferson was equally suspicious of the power of politicians and clerics
Yep.
alike. So, well, I guess that's it for this conversation. This has been a wonderful talk about the Johnson Amendment and the implications for churches. Another great episode of Just Liberty. And I hope you'll agree, my friends, and join us again for our next episode. And until then, remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So be informed and get involved.